Hello and welcome to the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Now this is going to be a series aimed at beginner or aspiring tanks. Historically tanking's always been one of the roles that people are really apprehensive to try just because of the perceived responsibility there and the fear of kind of messing stuff up and making other people angry at you. So I aim to just go over some of the basics of each dungeon, have a look at what you can do to improve your own experience and the experience of the group. So with that said, let's go right into the dungeon and have a look. Now, right away, the action starts with a pool of 3 mobs here. You have 1 Shadowmoon Bone Mender and 2 of the reanimated ritual bones. Now, the Bone Mender is a caster mob that will spam shadow bolts onto you. They hit for a moderate amount of damage. The damage can ramp up if you're not really interrupting or using some kind of defensive cooldown, so it's a good idea to use your stuns and interrupts on that mob, keep it locked down, interrupt the shadow mens mainly, or everything's just going to be healed up and you'll be ultimately wasting your time. As for the reanimated ritual bones, they do a void cleave that's going to damage you and anyone nearby, so it's a good idea to make sure that you're away from other ranged members so they aren't also receiving damage from that cleave attack. Descend the stairs here and face your first void spawn. Now, all of these enemies do is a basic melee attack to the tank, and they will try and cast Void Pulse. Now, Void Pulse will do a large amount of damage to your entire group, but it's interruptible. So the aim really is to never let them cast Void Pulse because it's just entirely avoidable. There's no reason to let it happen. You can lock it down with interrupts and stuns. Moving through to the next group here, there's sometimes a Void spawns here. It's not always. You can get unlucky and it's here, or you can luck out a bit and it's away, but in my case it was actually here, so we had to deal with it. So I'm just targeting that, interrupting the void pulses like before. The defiled spirits in this pool are pretty much a non-thing. They don't really do anything besides some light tank damage. The main mob in this pool would be the Shadowmoon Loyalist, which will spam some shadow bolts in the tank for a bit more damage. And the main danger here is the void sphere they'll conjure, and it'll travel towards a ranged member and it'll damage anyone that it passes through. So it's very slow moving, it's a good idea to move out of the way of this. Once that packs down, move on, avoid the ruins on the ground, they'll damage anyone who moves through them. Pretty easy mechanic. Onto this pack of the Corpse Skitterers. Now, as a tank, you don't need to worry about these very much, they do almost no damage. Just group them up so your DPS can kill them efficiently. Jump down the hole here, there's another pack of Void Skitterers, same as before, almost no damage. In this run I opt to carry the mobs forward into the next pack, just to speed up the dungeon a little bit. The next pack consists of another Bone Mender, just like the first pack, but instead this pack has 3 reanimated ritual bones instead of the 2 that you had before. So the damage on you is a little bit higher, but the pack is dealt with in largely the same way. The tank damage in this pool is relatively high, so it's perhaps a good place to use defensive cooldowns, but ultimately you shouldn't struggle too much unless you let the heals chain a lot. Move down the ramp here and there is a patrol of 2 void spawns that passes through here. Now 2 of those at one time can be a little difficult to handle, but in our run we managed to pass by quite easily and just avoid them entirely. So first boss here is Sadana Bloodfury. Now you'll notice the Ring of Ruins here, much like the ones we saw earlier. It's a simple matter of never standing on them. There's space between to move in between them, so not really any reason you should have to do that. The boss herself comes with a few abilities. The first one you'll notice she casts here is the Daggerfall. She'll conjure a sword in the air and it'll move slowly towards the ground, and once it's on the ground it's going to damage anyone that's in the impact zone. So eventually the area is going to fill up with these swords quite rapidly. Just keep moving the boss around. Make sure your melee players have space to stand in between. Now the next ability would be the Defiled Spirit. She'll summon a spirit far away from her and she'll begin to draw it in. If the spirit reaches her, then she'll be healed up for a pretty significant amount, but you can prevent that just by stunning the spirit, slowing the spirit. There's lots of stuff that works. Aid a bit in the DPS there and just kill it down. It doesn't have very much HP at all. One of the more damaging abilities she has would be the Dark Eclipse. She'll teleport to the centre of the room, she'll channel this Dark Eclipse, and she'll deal a large amount of damage to everyone that's not protected by one of the blue runes on the grounds. That's the one with the moons on them. You just want to have players stand on those runes, get the buff to reduce damage, and then when the Dark Eclipse is cast you'll find that it doesn't do very much. It's about an 80% reduction or so. One of the things you have to concern yourself with the tank is the Death Spike mechanic. She's going to put a buff on herself that will do extra damage on her melee attacks. It's extra shadow damage, so you can reduce it by magic damage reducing cooldowns. On a Death Knight, anti-magic shell is a good bet, just to reduce the damage there, stop some spike damage from various other sources, plus the melee attacks, plus the Death Spike. It can add up quickly. The final mechanic this boss has is the Whispers of the Dark Star. This is just a channeled ability that's going to deal damage to everyone in the group. Typically it does a bit less damage than her basic melee attack does, so you shouldn't really concern yourself with using a defensive cooldown here. And the next pack at the top of the stairs is one of the harder ones in the dungeon. It consists of 3 Shadowmoon Enslavers and 3 Subjugated Souls. Initially on the pool, the Shadowmoon Enslavers will be channeling a beam into the Subjugated Souls that increases the damage they deal. If the Shadowmoon Enslavers are not stunned or interrupted, they'll do nothing besides channel this beam. But as soon as they are disrupted in any way, then they'll begin to cast Rending Void Lash instead, which is just a channel dot they'll place on a party member. Usually it's the tank, but I found they can channel it on a few different members and it deals a very, very large amount of damage. So it's actually an idea not to disrupt their casting and just let them buff the Subjugated Souls, because those mobs don't really do very much damage at all and have no other abilities. Moving down the ramp here, there is another pack with a new mob, the Shadowmoon Exhumer. These mobs will attempt to exhume spirits from the crypts around them on the pool. Now you can stun this cast or you can death grip this cast, as I did here. It stops them from exhuming the spirits. Besides that, they'll just cast a Void Bolt on you. Much like the Shadow Bolt earlier, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage, shouldn't really be worried about. Besides the Shadowmoon Exhumers raising the spirits from the crypts, you can also raise them by having party members stand on them. Now, as pugs often are, it's easy to avoid these spirits, but obviously people who don't really know what they're doing are going to stand on them, they're going to spawn extra mobs. People are going to get angry and rage the same way things usually go. But they're not really much of a big deal to clean up. They don't have any abilities, they have quite low HP, so try not to lose your temper too much there and just tank them together, let the DPS kill them off. The next boss here would be Nylanth. Now he comes with his new set of abilities. The first one we'll see here is the Void Blast. It's a forward channel dot on the tank. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it's a good idea to use a defensive cooldown anyway. And he stops doing melee attacks during it, but it can deal a large amount of damage if you're not defending yourself appropriately. As a DK, I just use anti-magic shell. It makes you immune to the whole thing, you take 0 damage, so it's a bit of a cheese there. He also casts the Void Vortex mechanic, where he'll teleport to a random player in your party and begin to draw in anyone who's close to them whilst dealing damage to them. This is a simple matter of run away, don't get damaged. Even if you are caught in this, it's not a large amount of damage, so you shouldn't worry too much, but it's best just to get away so your healer isn't strained overly. The main mechanic of this fight is the soul steal, where Nylanth will steal the souls from all the players and transfer you to a shadowy realm. What you have to do in this realm is to kill the soul. Once it's dead, you can interact with it to reclaim it. Whilst you're in this realm, you take damage over time, so the longer it takes you to kill the soul, the more damage you will take. When the soul is dead, you will receive a damage and healing buff, so it's a good idea to save DPS cooldowns at this point, just so you can burst the boss a little bit more. Now, a mechanic you don't get to see here, but which may become more relevant in groups with lower DPS, is the Void Devastation. Now, he'll begin to channel a long spell, and he'll throw out shadow bolts into the air. These will arc into the air and then land on the ground, creating huge void zones. Now, they fill up a lot of space, so you have to make sure you're not in an area that's going to be bombarded by void zones. They'll do quite a lot of damage if you're standing in them, but there is usually quite a lot of safe locations, so it's just an easy matter of moving out of them. During this time, the boss won't actually do any attacks, so as a tank, there's not a whole lot to worry about there. Now, the next pool is another one with the Shadowmoon Exhumer. You can stun the Exhume the Crypts cast to stop them raising spirits. In addition to that, you have 2 more Shadowmoon Enslavers with the Rending Void Lash cast, along with the 2 Subjugated Souls they're initially buffing. Now, on this pool, I opt to use Army of the Dead. It's a relatively high damage pool because of the Rending Void Lashes, but the Army of the Dead can soak up those casts, so it works to great effect. You'll see on the side of the screen there's also a patrolling Exhumer. I Death Grip this in. You don't really have to worry about interrupting the Exhume the Crypts cast because there are no crypts in range for him to raise, so letting that go off isn't going to cause you any problem. Besides that, they'll do the usual of spamming the Void Bolt, just interrupt what you can and continue to burn the mob down. Now the next section of the dungeon includes lots of spiders and bats. The monstrous corpse spiders have two abilities. One is Death Venom, which is a single target nuke to a random party member. Now this is very deadly and should be interrupted. It has the chance of killing a player instantly if they're not on full HP. The second cast is a Necrotic Burst, which is going to deal a small amount of damage to your entire party. Now you can interrupt this one if you can, but you should prioritise Death Venom because ultimately Necrotic Burst won't kill people where Death Venom probably can. Continue to move down the hill here and you'll be faced with another group of Corpse Skitterings. Now, just like before, they don't do a whole lot, so I opt to drag them to the next pack, just throwing some AoE damage on so they're kept aggroed onto me as we go down. At the bottom here is a pack of 2 Corpse Spiders. Now it's a good idea in a pug perhaps to mark one of these as a skull marker. That'll make people focus it a bit more. As a tank you can probably prioritise interrupting the one who isn't skull marked. Do your group a favour, hopefully they'll stun the one that is being nuked. Just the same as before to get the Death Venoms as much as possible. If a lot of Necrotic Bursts go out at once, you can see your party dipping to quite low HP. It's a good idea to use a defensive cooldown just to give your healer some breathing space to heal up the rest of the group as well. Now approach this bridge area and you're greeted by a carrion worm emerging from the depths. Now he has 2 abilities. He'll attempt to do a body slam, which will damage anyone who's caught in it and knock them off the platform into the water. Now if you get knocked off, you're probably going to be mocked and laughed at by your entire group, and you'll have to swim all the way around and reach one of these water spouts that will knock you back in. The second ability the carrion worm has is a random spit, which just deals damage to people. It's not any more complicated than that. Patrolling across the bridge is another group of plague bats. Now we met these in the pack before. They'll stack an acid dot on the tank. It deals quite a high amount of damage, but it can also be blocked by damage reducing cooldowns, things like anti-magic shell. And as a dwarf I can also use stone form, which is great for removing diseases like that. At the end of the bridge is a second carrion worm. Just like the first one, you only have to get it down to 35% HP and then it will leave. And here we run into the third boss, which is a giant version of the carrion worms we just faced, Bonemaw. Now, Bonemaw has pretty similar abilities to the carrion worms that we just faced before, along with a few extra ones. The first thing we see here is the Corpse Breath. Now, it'll just deal damage to the whole party. Another good place where you can use anti-magic shell. There's a lot of nice spots in this dungeon for it. The second ability here is a body slam, much like the one on the worms that we faced previously. It will knock players off the platform if they're caught and deal a large amount of damage. Again, don't get hit by this, it's very easy. Just move out the way and you'll spare your group a whole lot of trouble. Now, one of the more dangerous mechanics he has here is the Inhale. When you spot him starting to cast the Inhale, you have to get out of melee range because you'll start drawing everyone in towards his mouth. If he manages to eat you, then he'll do a large amount of damage and he'll spit you into the water. So it's sort of similar to Body Slam in that regard, where you take damage and you end up in the water. So you can escape this Inhale simply by running away. If you're far enough away, then you're not going to get pulled in. But the alternative is to use the pools on the ground, the Necrotic Pitch, which he drops before. Standing in these will route you to the spot so you can't be drawn in by Inhale, but it'll also deal slight damage over time. So if you can avoid Inhale as a melee DPS without standing in the pools on the ground, you'll save your healer some trouble. I know it's popular for casters to stand there so they can continue to cast, which is okay, but as a melee and tank you can't be in melee range anyway, so it's a good idea to just move manually and avoid that. Now you might have noticed that the 2 carrion worms we met earlier have also shown up here. They'll just spit random targets and they'll also do body slams, so at times you can have 3 body slams overlapping, which as you can imagine can cause some problems where someone gets knocked in. Fortunately, these worms can be stunned, so it's a good idea for me to throw Strangulate on one of them, just to interrupt the body slams, do a bit of disruption there, and desync the body slam casts. Ultimately, the boss should be almost dead by the time these worms come up, so you shouldn't have to deal with them for very long. Moving on to the second to last pack here, it's a simple matter of dealing with 2 of the plague bats we met before, along with 2 of the monstrous corpse spiders. The same interrupt rules apply to the corpse spiders. Make sure death venom is interrupted at all costs. Additionally, the plague bats will stack the poison from before in the tank. Now this pack is quite high damage because of the combination of the 2 here, so it's a good idea to use your defensive cooldowns just so your healer has the space to heal up other party members as well. Moving on to the final pack here, it's a double void spawn pull. Now you may be familiar with this if you pulled the group before the first boss. As we skip them in this video, I'll go over the way to manage 2 at the same time. You can see here I mark a skull on one of them. Now I'm relying on the random members in the group here to actually follow the skull mark, and assuming that anyone with an interrupt or a stun is going to throw it on the skull marker. So to that end, I focus my Mind Freeze and Strangulate on the second one, just interrupt the cast of the AoE so the whole raid isn't damaged by that, because many casts of that can actually kill a group pretty quickly. So at last we reach the final boss of the dungeon, Ner'zhul. Now this boss isn't particularly difficult, but he does have one mechanic which can instantly kill your whole group, which we'll cover in a few moments. The first thing to be concerned with here as a tank is the direction that you face Ner'zhul in. He'll pretty often do a cast called Malevolence, which will deal a large amount of damage to anyone that's in a large frontal cone, and it will reduce the damage they deal by 50%. Understandably, you don't want anyone to be hit by this, so it's your job to position Ner'zhul such that he's not facing any other party members. He's often going to put down purple zones on the ground called Omen of Death. Now, standing directly in these does a large amount of damage, but they also deal proximity damage based on distance. So you want to try and drag Ner'zhul away from these as far as possible without being too far away, just to reduce the damage that melee DPS players and yourself is taking from the Omen, because the further away you are, the less damage you will take, and the easier the job is for the healer. So down to the deadly mechanic here, also known as Ritual of Bones. Ner'zhul is going to summon a line of skeletons on one side of the room. Now they'll walk together in sync, like something out of a Thriller music video, across the room, and behind them is going to be a deadly shadow zone. Anyone who goes in this shadow zone is likely to die pretty much instantly. It's very high damage. Fortunately, you can disrupt the shadow zone by killing one or more of the Ritual of Bones skeletons. As you kill one, an opening will appear in the zone. So it's a good idea here to mark one of the Ritual of Bones with a skull marker. Take the responsibility upon yourself. People will perhaps follow the mark and everyone can focus one individual skeleton down. Once a gap is opened up, you shouldn't run through instantly as a tank. What's likely to happen if you do this is Ner'zhul will follow you, and he'll aim his Malevolence right down the entire gap, and judging to the narrow nature of the gap that's available, a lot of your players are going to be caught in that. It's a good idea to wait and let the gap move past you and aim Ner'zhul in the opposite direction. This is just one of the small things you can do to make your quality of life for the group a little bit better. So if you can get through the Ritual of Bones mechanic, there's not a whole lot to deal with this in this boss, and you'll be quickly greeted with your dungeon complete screen and the versatility loot that you so deserve, as I've got here. So hopefully this helps some people out. If you're apprehensive about tanking, I say just give it a go. A lot of people in random groups are going to be pretty mean and toxic regardless of what you do, so the best you can do is just do what you can, perform the best that you can, and hopefully use some of the tips that I've given here. So thank you for watching.